So let's start off with electronica music this week, which I've been a huge fan of for over 20 years. My foray into electronic music started with Wipeout XL back on the PlayStation, way back in 1996. And this soundtrack had a licensed soundtrack, so there's one of my favorite bands of all time, Prodigy, was on it. There's Daft Punk before they got huge, Orbital, Chemical Brothers, Fluke, Future Sound of London, Underworld, and the list just goes on and on. Not only did Wipeout XL really give me a taste for electronic music, it also really inspired me to start writing my own music in 1997 using my pseudonym SynthR, which I still use today. I really look to video games to pull out those themes of adventure and the epic scope of some of these games, like Mass Effect, and like being in space and flying around to save the universe. Like, I really was inspired by that stuff to somehow make a story out of a song using electronic sounds and those video games as an inspiration. And this is why this topic is so important to me, because video game music goes well beyond just being something that's inside a video game that you just listen to as you play it. Video game music has been a huge inspiration on me as an artist, because there's some fantastic music in video games. You can't deny that. Like, the Final Fantasy series has epic, amazingly composed music, and you cannot deny that. So that's kind of where I'm coming from this. So I'm coming from it as an artist who is inspired by this stuff, as someone who knows what it takes to create a song and do sound design and stuff like that. I get all that. I appreciate that, because I've done that as a hobby for so long. I'm a huge electronic person, and having these types of games like Wipeout, Extreme G, Roll Cage, many other type of futuristic racing games, bringing together all these amazing electronic artists for their soundtracks was just a way for me to discover music that I would never hear on the radio. Because Wipeout XL came out just before bands like Prodigy and Chemical Brothers and Crystal Method became huge, because in 1997, 1998, electronic music really had this huge movement forward. So it was kind of great to get in on it before it even became super popular for the few years or last few years of the 90s.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, like, do you know what the birthplace of that sort of music came from, like where it started?
I've always been a fan of electronic music in other genres, but I didn't really listen to like old school rave music or any of that stuff that was in the early 90s until a bit later. And like the Prodigy started in the late 80s, basically doing like rave style music that I'll show you some in a little bit. But it's basically like jungle, really drum heavy, lots of samples, stuff like that. But electronic music really has its roots back in the 70s almost, but it started to take off late 80s, early 90s. It started to pick up. There's a lot of underground stuff. And then around 1997, that's when it blew up, because Prodigy came, they put out Firestarter. Daft Punk had their Homework album come out, and it had a couple hits like The Funk and Around the World on it. Chemical Brothers became huge, Crystal Method. It just spiraled out of control basically in the late 90s. And some of these games were like on point. They were putting these games out exactly when they needed to with these tracks to maximize on like the popularity of it.
Yeah, I knew music had changed when there was a song that literally just had one line that said "Around the World" in it. I knew we were entering a fucking golden era of technology and music fusion.
Well, the other thing to remember about this too is that, like, you know, at the time, you were stuck listening to the radio, and whatever the radio decided to play is what you heard. So your options were like very limited, because a rock station or an alternative station is not going to play something like Prodigy or Daft Punk, at least not at first. That's something that would come much later. But, you know, all of us as kids were playing games like Wipeout and being exposed to something we'd never been exposed to before. It gave rise to, there was a short-lived TV show on MTV called AMP that would air very late, like on a Sunday night, and it would play music videos for things like Orbital. I remember seeing the video for The Box by Orbital, a great song, and being very hypnotized by it, along with things like Future Sound of London and some of the other alumni from the Wipeout soundtracks. And it totally blew me away. I'd never heard anything like it before. And like Matt said, like SynthR said, it started out like it built upon that 1970s kind of vibe, because in the late 70s you've got artists like Kraftwerk and Gary Newman and Einstürzen and Weiten and all these great electronic artists who are experimenting with something very new. And Prodigy, Daft Punk, Orbital, and so on are just sort of the extension of that.
Yeah, I knew we were doomed when one of my favorite guitar players back in the day, Joe Satriani, did a electronica album where all the music under his guitar parts was all techno-y and stuff, and I'm like, oh no, here we go.
Well, how long did that last?
One album, and then he realized that wasn't the future that we all thought, but